Chapter 1. The quiet life. David Benson's apartment was the kind of place that looked like it belonged to someone who had mastered the art of living alone. Not in a sad way. There were no empty pizza boxes stacked in corners or laundry mountains threatening to collapse, but in a way that spoke of quiet efficiency. The kitchen counters gleamed, the floors were spotless, and the only sound was the soft hum of his electronic keyboard sitting against the far wall, waiting like an old friend. David sat on the edge of his couch, elbows on his knees, staring at the keyboard. His fingers twitched, wanting to play, but his mind was elsewhere, looping through the same thought like a scratched record. Leadership changes. HR reviews. What if they ask about my diploma? He rubbed his face and exhaled slowly. 34 years old, and still haunted by a decision he made at 16. Dropping out had felt like survival back then. Now it felt like a ticking time bomb. He stood abruptly, pacing the length of his living room. "You've been here 16 years, he muttered to himself. Never late, never a problem. They're not going to care about a piece of paper. But the thought wouldn't leave. It never did. His brain had a way of grabbing onto worries and shaking them like a dog with a chew toy. He knew why. He'd read enough articles to recognize the patterns. Attention deficit disorder. No official diagnosis, no medication, just him. A mind that wandered like a kid in a candy store, except the candy was every thought he didn't want to think. He stopped pacing and turned to the keyboard. The black and white keys glowed faintly under the lamp, and just looking at them made the fog in his head thin out. Music was the only thing that ever did that. He sat down, powered it on, and let his fingers fall into a familiar progression. A soft jazz riff filled the room, warm and smooth, like a conversation with someone who understood him completely. For a few minutes, there was no HR review, no diploma, no gnawing sense of being behind everyone else. Just sound. Just clarity. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, breaking the spell. He glanced at the screen. Fred. David sighed and picked up. "Hey, Benny." Fred's voice boomed through the speaker, full of cheer. "You alive over there?" "Last I checked," David said dryly. Fred laughed. "Good. Listen, we're all hitting up that new jazz club after work Friday. You're coming." David hesitated. No, you're coming. You never come out with us, man. It's time." "I'm not really." "Not negotiable," Fred cut in. "You've been hiding in that apartment like a monk. You need a night out. Drinks, music, people. You know, life." David stared at the keyboard, fingers still resting on the keys. "I like my apartment. And your apartment likes you. Great love story. But come on, Benny. One night. You'll thank me." David opened his mouth to argue, but Fred was already barreling ahead. 8 o'clock. I'll text you the address. Wear something that doesn't look like you just cleaned a boiler room." The line went dead before David could respond. He set the phone down and groaned. Socializing wasn't his thing. Crowds made his brain feel like a pinball machine. Too many lights, too many sounds, too many conversations to track. But saying no to Fred was like saying no to gravity. The man was relentless. David played another chord, softer this time, and let it linger. Maybe one night wouldn't kill him. Maybe. Friday came faster than he wanted. David stood in front of his closet, staring at rows of identical work shirts and jeans. "Wear something that doesn't look like you just cleaned a boiler room," Fred had said. David snorted. "Yeah, sure. Let me just grab my tux." He settled on a dark button-up and the least worn pair of jeans he owned. It would have to do. The club was already buzzing when he arrived. Neon lights glowed against brick walls, and the low thrum of bass spilled out onto the street. Inside, the air was thick with laughter and the scent of whiskey. David spotted his coworkers at a corner table, Fred waving like a man trying to flag down a rescue helicopter. "Benny," Fred bellowed as David approached. "Look at you. You clean up nice." David rolled his eyes. "I look like me." "Exactly," Fred said, clapping him on the back. "Grab a drink. Loosen up." David slid into a chair, nodding at the others. They were already halfway through their first round, voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony. He ordered a beer and tried to relax, but his attention kept drifting to the stage where a band was setting up. Jazz. Real jazz. Upright bass, saxophone, drums, and his heart skipped a grand piano. He felt the pull immediately, like gravity had shifted. The pianist adjusted the sheet music, fingers brushing the keys, and David's own hands twitched in response. He could almost feel the weight of the ivory under his fingertips, the way the notes would bloom like flowers if he just... "Earth to Benny," Fred said, snapping his fingers. "You good?" David blinked. "Yeah, fine." Fred grinned. "You look like you're about to marry that piano." David smirked but didn't answer. He couldn't explain it. Not to Fred, not to anyone. Music wasn't just a hobby. It was oxygen. The band launched into their first set, and David was gone, lost in the cascade of notes, the way the sax curled around the melody like smoke. For the first time all week, his mind was quiet. He didn't know then that this night, the one he tried to avoid, was about to change everything. Chapter 2. The night that changed everything. David was halfway through his beer when the urge to move hit him. It wasn't the music, though the band was good, really good. It was the pressure in his bladder reminding him that 2 hours of nursing drinks had consequences. He excused himself from the table, weaving through the crowd toward the hallway marked with a glowing restroom sign. The hallway was narrow, lined with posters of past performers, sepia-toned legends and bright-eyed newcomers frozen mid-note. David barely glanced at them. His mind was still humming with the band's last number, a smoky rendition of Autumn Leaves that had made his fingers itch for keys. He was 2 steps from the bathroom door when voices stopped him. "We can't go on without him," a man hissed, his tone sharp with panic. David froze, head tilting toward the stage door cracked open just enough to spill light into the hallway. He didn't mean to eavesdrop, but his brain decided this was more important than emptying his bladder. He edged closer, listening. "Half our set needs piano," another voice said, softer but no less worried. "We can't fake that. What do you want me to do?" "He's at the hospital. His wife's in labor." David blinked. Their pianist was gone? Mid-show? His pulse quickened, a strange cocktail of nerves and excitement flooding his veins. He could hear the muffled roar of the crowd beyond the door, waiting for the next set. The band was stuck, and there, like a neon sign in his mind, was the thought, "I can play." His feet moved before his brain caught up. He pushed the door open wider and 3 faces turned toward him. 2 men and a woman, all dressed in sleek black stage attire. The woman's eyes were sharp, framed by dark curls and a voice that sounded like velvet when she spoke. "Can we help you?" she asked, wary. David swallowed hard. I overheard. You need a pianist." The tallest man frowned. "You're with the club?" "No," David said quickly. "I'm just a guy, but I've been playing since the 5th grade. If you've got sheet music, I can handle it." The 3 exchanged looks. Skepticism radiated off them like heat. The woman crossed her arms. "You're telling me you can sight read our set list cold?" David nodded, surprising even himself with the steadiness in his voice. "As long as you've got the charts." The shorter man snorted. "This isn't chopsticks, buddy. These are complex arrangements." David's lips curved into a small smile. "Then it'll be fun." For a beat, silence hung heavy. Then the woman sighed, muttering something under her breath before stepping forward. "Sandra Marlow," she said, offering her hand. "Lead vocals." David shook it, her grip firm and warm. "David Benson." "David?" she repeated, studying him like she was trying to read the notes of his soul. "You're sure about this?" "Positive." Another pause. Then the tall man shrugged. "We're out of options." Sandra grabbed a folder from a nearby chair and thrust it at him. "Here, 2 sets plus encores. You've got 10 minutes. David flipped through the sheets, scanning the titles. Blue and Green, Take 5, Misty. His heart soared. These weren't just songs. They were old friends. He looked up, grinning. "Let's melt some souls." 10 minutes later, David stood behind the grand piano on stage, a borrowed jacket draped over his shoulders and a fedora tilted just so. The lights were blinding, the crowd a sea of expectant faces. His coworkers sat near the front, jaws slack, eyes wide. Fred looked like someone had just handed him front-row tickets to a miracle. David flexed his fingers, letting them hover over the keys. For a moment, the world narrowed to black and white, ivory and ebony, order and chaos in perfect balance. Then he began to play. The first notes spilled out like liquid gold, smooth and confident. The room hushed, conversations dying mid-sentence as heads turned toward the stage. David didn't notice. He was gone, lost in the music, in the clarity that only came when his fingers danced across keys. Sandra's voice slid in like silk, wrapping around the melody. The band followed, their initial caution melting into grins as they realized. This guy wasn't just good. He was extraordinary. They played 3 sets, each one tighter, brighter, more electric than the last. When the crowd demanded an encore, David laughed, a sound so rare it startled even him, and launched into a blistering riff that had people on their feet. By the time the final chord faded, David was drenched in sweat and high on adrenaline. He stood, heart pounding, as the band gathered around him. "Holy hell," the tall man said, clapping him on the back. "Where have you been hiding?" Sandra's smile was slow, warm, and just a little dangerous. "You saved us tonight," she said softly. "Thank you." David shrugged, suddenly shy. "Happy to help." She pressed a folded bill into his hand. "Your cut." He shook his head. "Give it to your guy. Tell him congrats on the baby." Sandra stared at him for a long moment, something unreadable flickering in her eyes. Then she smiled again, brighter this time. "You're something else, David Benson." He didn't know what to say, so he just smiled back. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel invisible. Chapter 3. The spotlight. The applause was still echoing in David's ears when he stepped off the stage. Jacket slung over one arm, fedora tilted back like a crown he hadn't asked for. His pulse was a drumbeat in his chest, steady and strong. And for the first time in years, he felt alive. Not just breathing, not just existing, alive. The band clustered around him in the green room, faces flushed with relief and exhilaration. The tall man, Marcus, he'd learned, was grinning like a kid on Christmas morning. "Man," Marcus said, clapping David on the back hard enough to make him stumble. You didn't just save us. You owned that stage. David chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. Just doing what I love. Sandra was leaning against the wall, arms crossed, watching him with eyes that seemed to see more than he wanted to show. Her curls framed her face like a halo, though there was nothing angelic about the way she smiled, slow, deliberate, like she was savoring a secret. You weren't nervous, she said, voice low and smooth. Not even for a second. David shrugged. Piano's different. It's the only thing that makes sense. Sandra tilted her head, studying him. You play like someone who's been doing this professionally for years. He laughed softly. Not even close. Her brows lifted. Then where have you been hiding? David opened his mouth, then closed it again. What was he supposed to say? I'm a custodian who spends his nights playing to an audience of one. Instead, he offered a half smile. Long story. Sandra's lips curved. I like long stories. Before David could respond, Marcus shoved a bottle of water into his hand. Seriously, man, you saved our asses tonight. We owe you. David shook his head. You don't owe me anything. Sandra stepped closer, her perfume a whisper of jasmine and something darker. We do, she said softly. And I'm not just talking about money. David felt heat creep up his neck. He wasn't used to attention, especially not from someone like her. Confident, magnetic, the kind of woman who could walk into a room and make it hers without trying. He cleared his throat. Really, it was nothing. Sandra's smile said she didn't believe that for a second. When David finally made it back to the main room, his coworkers were waiting like a pack of wolves scenting fresh meat. Fred was front and center, grinning so wide David worried his face might split. Benny, Fred roared, grabbing David by the shoulders. What the hell was that? David blinked. Music. Music. Fred barked a laugh. That wasn't music. That was sorcery. You didn't tell us you could play like that. David shrugged, suddenly wishing for invisibility. Never came up. Never came up. Fred repeated, turning to the others. Did you hear that? 16 years I've known this guy, and he's been hiding a superpower. The others chimed in, voices overlapping. Praise, questions, disbelief. David tried to smile, tried to deflect, but the attention was like standing under a spotlight he hadn't asked for. Seriously, man? Fred said, clapping him on the back. You could quit tomorrow and make a living doing this. David's stomach tightened. He couldn't quit. He couldn't risk it. Music was freedom, but his job was survival. He forced a laugh. Not looking to start a new career. Fred squinted at him. You should think about it. David didn't answer. He couldn't, because for the first time in his life, the idea didn't sound completely insane. Later, as the crowd thinned and the band packed up, Sandra found him near the bar. She moved like music, graceful, fluid, impossible to ignore. David felt his pulse spike as she stopped in front of him, her smile soft but sure. Hey, she said. Hey, he echoed, suddenly aware of how awkward his hands felt. You were incredible tonight. David shook his head. Just filling in. Sandra's eyes glinted. Don't downplay it. You didn't just fill in. You lit that stage on fire. He swallowed, unsure what to do with the warmth in her voice. Thanks. She leaned in slightly, her tone dropping to something intimate. We rehearse twice a week. Our pianist's out for a while. You should come by. David blinked. Think about it, she said, slipping a card into his hand. Her fingers brushed his, light as a note on the wind. Call me. And then she was gone, leaving David staring at the card like it was a ticket to a world he'd never dared imagine. That night, lying in bed, David couldn't sleep. His mind was a carousel of images. Sandra's smile, the roar of applause, the feel of the keys under his fingers. For years, he'd kept his life small, safe, invisible. Now, for the first time, he wondered what it would feel like to step into the light. Chapter 4. Ripples. Monday morning hit like a cymbal crash. Loud, jarring, impossible to ignore. David stood in front of the bathroom mirror, toothbrush dangling from his mouth, staring at his own reflection like it might offer answers. Didn't. It just looked back at him with the same tired eyes, the same stubborn cowlick, the same man who had spent 16 years keeping his head down. Except now everyone knew. He spat, rinsed, and muttered, You should have said no. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were a lie. He couldn't have said no. Not to the piano. Not to that stage. Not to the way it felt when the music burned through the fog in his head and left nothing but clarity. Still, the thought of walking into work made his stomach twist. He could already hear Fred's booming voice, the teasing, the questions. He hated questions. They were like spotlights, bright, hot, exposing everything he wanted to keep hidden. The custodial office was buzzing when he arrived. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as heads turned toward him. David felt the weight of their stares like bricks on his shoulders. Benny. Fred's voice cut through the room like a trumpet blast. He barreled toward David, grinning like a man who just won the lottery. Look who decided to grace us with his presence. David forced a smile. Morning. Morning. Fred laughed. That's all you've got? After Friday night? You were a damn rock star. David winced. It wasn't. It was, Fred said, clapping him on the back hard enough to make him stumble. You should have seen yourself. Hell, I've got videos. The internet's gonna love you. David froze. Videos? Fred grinned. Oh yeah, you're trending in the company group chat. Custodian by day, jazz god by night. That's what they're calling you. David's pulse spiked. Fred, relax, Fred said, waving a hand. It's all good press. Makes us look classy. David didn't answer. His mind was already spiraling HR reviews, leadership changes, rumors. He'd spent years building a life so quiet it barely made a sound. Now, thanks to one impulsive decision, he was a headline in a chat thread. He was scrubbing down a break room counter when his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and froze. Sandra Marlow. His breath caught. He hadn't saved her number, but he didn't need to. The name was burned into his memory like a melody he couldn't stop humming. Hey, Maestro. Still riding the high from Friday. David stared at the message, heart thudding. Maestro. No one had ever called him that. He wiped his hands on a rag and typed back slowly, carefully. Hey, yeah. Still a little surreal. The reply came fast. Surreal for us too. You were incredible. Seriously, we'd love to have you at rehearsal tomorrow night. No pressure. Just music. David swallowed hard. His thumb hovered over the keyboard. He wanted to say yes. God, he wanted to. But the old fears clawed at him. Attention meant risk. Risk meant exposure. Exposure meant losing everything he'd worked for. He typed, I'll think about it. Sandra's response was a single word, warm and teasing. Promise? David stared at the screen for a long moment before typing back. Promise. That night, lying in bed, David couldn't stop replaying the day. The laughter at work, Fred's relentless teasing, Sandra's voice in his head like a velvet ribbon. He'd spent his whole life believing small was safe. But now, small felt suffocating. And for the first time, he wondered if stepping into the light was worth the risk. Chapter 5. First rehearsal. David stood outside the studio door, heart thudding like a bass drum. The building was tucked between a coffee shop and a tattoo parlor, its brick facade worn but proud, like it had seen decades of music and wasn't done yet. A neon sign above the door glowed faintly, Marlow and Company. He stared at it for a long moment, wondering if he was about to make the biggest mistake of his life, or the best decision he'd ever dared. He almost turned back. Almost. But then he thought of Friday night. The lights, the applause, the way the music had burned through the fog in his head and left nothing but clarity. He thought of Sandra's voice, warm and teasing. Promise? And before he could talk himself out of it, he pushed the door open. The studio smelled like old wood and ambition. Instruments were scattered across the room, drums gleaming under soft lights, a saxophone resting on a stand, a bass leaning against the wall like it was taking a break. And there, in the center, was a grand piano. David's pulse kicked up another notch. David! Sandra's voice floated across the room, smooth as silk. She was perched on a stool, dark curls tumbling over her shoulders, a smile curving her lips like she'd been waiting just for him. Hey! He said, trying to sound casual and failing miserably. You came, she said, hopping off the stool and crossing the room with effortless grace. Her perfume was a whisper of jasmine and something deeper, something that made his thoughts scatter like leaves in the wind. Yeah, he said, rubbing the back of his neck. Figured I'd check it out. Sandra's smile widened. You mean check us out? David chuckled softly. Something like that. Marcus appeared from behind the drum kit, grinning. Look who decided to join the party. Man, we still owe you for Friday. David shook his head. You don't owe me anything. Don't argue, Marcus said, waving a hand. Just play. Sandra gestured toward the piano. Your throne awaits. David walked over, fingers itching to touch the keys. He sat down, the bench creaking under him, and let his hands hover for a moment. The room was quiet, expectant. Then he played. A soft, rolling progression that filled the space like sunlight spilling through a window. Sandra closed her eyes, swaying slightly. God, you make it sound easy. David smiled without looking up. It is, when it's the only thing that makes sense. Her eyes opened, locking on his. You really love it, don't you? He nodded, still playing. It's the only time my brain shuts up. Sandra tilted her head, curiosity flickering in her gaze. Shuts up. David hesitated, then shrugged. It's noisy up there. Music quiets it. For a moment, she said nothing. Then her voice softened. That's beautiful. David felt heat creep up his neck. He wasn't used to people calling anything about him beautiful. He cleared his throat. So, what are we playing? Sandra grinned, snapping her fingers at Marcus. Let's start with Misty. Warm up the room. The rehearsal was magic. The band fell into rhythm like they'd been doing it for years, and David was alive. His fingers danced across the keys, weaving melodies that wrapped around Sandra's voice like silk threads. She sang with her whole soul, eyes half closed, lips curving around each note like it was a secret meant only for him. Between songs, there was laughter, Marcus cracking jokes, the The bassist complaining about his strings. Sandra teasing David about his mysterious vibe. Mysterious? He echoed, raising a brow. She smirked. You show up out of nowhere, save a band in distress, refuse payment, and vanish like a jazz Batman. That's mysterious. David chuckled. I'm not Batman. Sandra leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a playful whisper. You sure? Because you've got the brooding thing down. David laughed, shaking his head. I'm not brooding. She said, eyes glinting. Keep telling yourself that. When rehearsal ended, Sandra walked him to the door. The night air was cool, carrying the faint hum of traffic and the distant wail of a saxophone from some other club down the street. Thanks for coming, she said, her tone softer now, almost shy. It was really good having you here. David nodded, hands shoved in his pockets to keep them from fidgeting. Yeah, it was fun. Sandra hesitated, then smiled. A slow, warm smile that made something in his chest tighten. Same time Thursday? David swallowed hard. He wanted to say yes. He wanted to say hell yes. But the old fears clawed at him, attention, risk, exposure. He forced a smile. I'll think about it. Sandra's eyes softened. Promise. David met her gaze, and for a moment, the world narrowed to just the two of them. He nodded. Promise. That night, lying in bed, David stared at the ceiling. His mind a whirl of music and laughter, and the way Sandra's smile had felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. He'd spent years keeping his life small, safe, invisible. Now, he wasn't sure he wanted to anymore. Chapter 6. Coffee and Confessions. David wasn't sure why his hands were sweating. It was just coffee. People had coffee all the time. But as he stood outside the cafe Sandra had picked, a cozy little place with warm lights and the smell of roasted beans curling out into the street, his pulse was doing double time like a drummer on a solo. He pushed the door open, and the bell chimed softly. The cafe was intimate, all mismatched chairs and shelves lined with books no one ever read. Jazz played low from hidden speakers, a lazy saxophone drifting through the air like smoke. David felt his shoulders loosen a fraction. At least the soundtrack was familiar. Sandra was already there, sitting at a corner table by the window. She wore a soft gray sweater that made her dark curls look even richer. And when she saw him, her smile was like sunlight breaking through clouds. You made it, she said, standing to greet him. Yeah, David said, trying not to sound like he'd spent 20 minutes outside debating whether to run. Traffic wasn't bad. Sandra's eyes glinted with amusement. You walked, didn't you? David chuckled. Maybe. She laughed, a warm, melodic sound that made something in his chest tighten. Come on, sit. He slid into the chair across from her, the wood creaking under his weight. A barista appeared, all tattoos and easy smiles, and took their orders. Sandra went for a caramel latte. David stuck with black coffee, simple, predictable, safe. When the drinks arrived, Sandra wrapped her hands around her cup, leaning forward slightly. So, she said, her voice soft but curious. Tell me about you. David blinked. Me? Yes, you, she said, smiling. The man who plays like a dream but disappears like smoke. He shifted in his seat, suddenly wishing for an escape hatch. Not much to tell. Sandra tilted her head. I don't believe that. David stared at his coffee, watching the steam curl upward like thoughts he couldn't catch. Work. I play piano. That's about it. Sandra's brows lifted. Work where? Custodial services, he said, bracing for the look. The one people always gave when they realized he wasn't impressive. But Sandra didn't flinch. She just nodded, her expression calm, almost thoughtful. Honest work. David blinked. You're not surprised? Why would I be? She said, sipping her latte. You keep things clean. That's important. David stared at her, thrown off balance. Most people treated his job like a footnote. Sandra treated it like a fact, nothing more, nothing less. It was disarming. He cleared his throat. Dropped out of school when I was 16. Been working ever since. Sandra's gaze softened. That must have been hard. David shrugged. It was harder staying. She didn't press, and he was grateful. Instead, she smiled gently. And the piano? David's lips curved, almost involuntarily. That's everything. Sandra leaned in, her voice dropping to something intimate. You play like it's your heartbeat. David swallowed hard. Feels like it. For a moment, silence stretched between them. Not awkward, but charged. Like the pause before a note that changes everything. Sandra's eyes held his, warm and steady. And David felt something shift inside him. Something he hadn't felt in years. They talked for an hour about music, about favorite songs, about the way jazz felt like freedom. Sandra told him about her childhood, growing up in a house where Billie Holiday was practically a family member. David listened, captivated, her words painting pictures he wanted to frame and keep forever. When they finally stepped outside, the evening air was cool, brushing against his skin like a whisper. Sandra turned to him, her smile soft but sure. Thursday, she said. Rehearsal. You'll be there. David hesitated. The old fears clawed at him, attention, risk, exposure. But then he thought of the music, of Sandra's laugh, of the way her eyes had looked across that table. He nodded. Yeah, I'll be there. Sandra's smile widened, and for a moment, David felt like he'd just agreed to more than a rehearsal. That night, lying in bed, David stared at the ceiling, his mind humming with melodies and the memory of Sandra's voice saying his name like it mattered. He'd spent years keeping his life small, safe, invisible. Now, he wasn't sure he wanted to anymore. Chapter 7. Complications. By Thursday morning, David was starting to feel like a man living two lives. At work, he was the same steady presence, quiet, reliable, the guy who never missed a shift and never made waves. But outside those walls, something new was stirring. Music, laughter, Sandra, and rumors. He heard them before he even clocked in. Two guys from the night crew were huddled near the vending machine, voices low but not low enough. Did you see that video? Benson's like some kind of jazz prodigy. No kidding. Makes you wonder why he's pushing a mop instead of playing Carnegie Hall. David kept walking, pretending he hadn't heard, but the words clung to him like static. He'd spent years building a life so quiet it barely made a sound. Now, thanks to one impulsive night, he was trending in the company chat. Fred cornered him before lunch, grinning like a man who'd just discovered buried treasure. Benny, you ready for your big break? David frowned. What are you talking about? Fred slapped a printout on the table, a flyer for the jazz club, with Sandra's band front and center. They're playing Saturday. Guess who everyone's betting will be on piano? David's stomach dropped. Fred, don't Fred me, he said, eyes gleaming. You've got talent, man. Real talent. You should be out there, not stuck in here worrying about floor wax. David stiffened. I'm not worried about floor wax. Fred's grin softened into something almost paternal. Then what are you worried about? David hesitated, then shook his head. Nothing. But it wasn't nothing. It was everything. HR reviews. Leadership changes. The fact that one question, do you have a diploma, could unravel 16 years of stability. He couldn't afford attention. He couldn't afford risk. And yet, when his phone buzzed during break, his pulse jumped. Sandra Marlow, hey maestro, big gig Saturday night. Come play with us? David stared at the screen, heart thudding. He wanted to say yes, God, he wanted to, but the old fears clawed at him. Attention meant exposure. Exposure meant losing everything. He typed, I don't know if I can. Her reply came fast, warm, teasing. Can't or won't. David exhaled slowly, fingers hovering over the keyboard. He thought of the music, of Sandra's laugh, of the way her eyes had looked across that cafe table like she saw him. Not the custodian, not the dropout, but him. He typed, maybe. Sandra's response was a single word, soft as a note on the wind. Maybe means yes, so, promise? David stared at the screen for a long moment before typing back. Promise. That night, lying in bed, David felt the weight of two worlds pressing down on him. The safe, quiet life he'd built and the bright, unpredictable one calling his name. He didn't know which one would break him first, but he knew which one made him feel alive. Chapter 8. The gig, Saturday night, pulsed with energy. The jazz club was packed, shoulder-to-shoulder bodies, laughter spilling like champagne, and the low hum of anticipation vibrating through the air. David stood near the stage door, heart pounding like a drum solo. He'd said yes. Against every instinct screaming for safety, he'd said yes. Sandra spotted him first. She was radiant under the soft glow of the backstage lights, dark curls tumbling over her shoulders, a black dress hugging her like it had been designed for her alone. When she smiled, David felt the world tilt. You came, she said, voice warm and rich as velvet. David managed to smile. Yeah. Sandra stepped closer, her perfume a whisper of jasmine and something deeper, something that made his thoughts scatter like leaves in the wind. You ready to make magic? David swallowed hard. Hope so. Her eyes glinted. You don't hope. You do. The stage was a living thing, lights blazing, crowd buzzing, instruments gleaming like polished jewels. David slid onto the piano bench, fingers hovering over the keys. The room hushed, expectant. Then Sandra's voice cut through the silence, sultry and smooth. Ladies and gentlemen, let's melt some souls. The first notes spilled out like liquid gold. David's fingers danced, weaving melodies that curled around Sandra's voice like silk threads. The band locked in, tight and electric, and the crowd leaned forward as if drawn by gravity. Song after song, the energy built, smoky ballads giving way to blistering riffs, Sandra's voice soaring while David's hands blurred across the keys. He was gone, lost in the music, in the clarity that only came when everything else fell away. By the third set, the room was on fire. People clapped, whistled, shouted for more. When the encore hit, David launched into a riff so bold it made Sandra laugh mid-verse, a laugh that slid straight into his bloodstream and stayed there. After the final chord faded, the applause was deafening. David stood, breathless, as the band gathered around him, grinning like kids on Christmas morning. Marcus clapped him on the back. Man, you killed it. Sandra's smile was slower, softer, and infinitely more dangerous. You didn't just kill it, she said, voice low. You brought it back to life. David chuckled. rubbing the back of his neck. Just doing what I love. Sandra stepped closer, her eyes locking on his. And you do it beautifully. For a moment, the world narrowed to just the two of them. The hum of the crowd fading, the lights dimming, everything else dissolving into the space between her gaze and his. Sandra's hand brushed his arm, light as a note on the wind. David's breath caught. He could feel it, the pull, the spark, the inevitability of something about to happen. Her lips curved, slow and deliberate, and he thought, this is it. Then Marcus barreled in, grinning like a fool. Group photo. Come on, maestro. The moment shattered like glass. Sandra laughed softly, stepping back, and David forced a smile as the band crowded around him for pictures. But his pulse was still racing, and his skin still burned where her fingers had touched. Later, as the crowd thinned and the night air cooled, Sandra found him near the stage door. Her smile was softer now, almost shy. Thanks for tonight, she said. You were incredible. David swallowed hard. So were you. Sandra's eyes held his for a long moment, something unspoken shimmering between them. Then she smiled, a slow, warm smile that made his chest tighten. See you Tuesday? She asked. David nodded. Yeah, Tuesday. And as he walked home under the city lights, his heart still pounding, David knew one thing for certain. He was in trouble. Chapter 9. Cracks in the armor. Tuesday night should have felt like magic. The studio was warm, the lights soft, the piano gleaming like an old friend waiting to be touched. But David's hands hovered over the keys, stiff and uncertain. His mind wasn't here, not in the music, not in the moment. It was back at work, replaying Fred's words like a broken record. You could quit tomorrow and make a living doing this. Except he couldn't. Not when one question, do you have a diploma, could unravel everything. He'd built his life on silence, on staying small and safe. Now, every note he played felt like a spotlight. Sandra noticed before anyone else. She always did. You okay? She asked softly, leaning against the piano, her curls brushing her shoulders like ink strokes on parchment. David forced a smile. Yeah, just tired. Sandra's eyes narrowed, sharp and knowing. You're lying. David blinked. What? You play like you're carrying something heavy, she said, voice low but steady. What is it? He looked away, fingers tracing the edge of the keys. It's nothing. Sandra didn't move. David. Her voice was gentle, but it held a weight that made him stop. He exhaled slowly, the fight draining out of him. I'm scared. Sandra tilted her head. Of what? David swallowed hard. The words felt jagged in his throat. Of being seen. For a moment, silence stretched between them, thick, charged, like the pause before a storm. Sandra didn't speak. She just waited, her gaze steady, her presence quiet but unyielding. David's hands curled into fists. I dropped out of school when I was 16. Never went back. No diploma, no degree. Just me. A guy who cleans floors and plays piano when no one's looking. Sandra's expression softened, her eyes shimmering with something he couldn't name. David. He shook his head, the words tumbling out now, raw and unfiltered. If they find out at work, I'm done. 16 years gone. And now everyone's talking, and I feel like I'm standing on a stage with no clothes on. Sandra reached out, her fingers brushing his arm, light, warm, grounding. Hey, she said softly. Look at me. He did, slowly, reluctantly, and when his eyes met hers, the storm inside him stilled just a little. You're not broken, she said, her voice like velvet on steel. You're brilliant. You hear music the way most people hear air. That's not something a piece of paper can give you. David's throat tightened. You don't understand. I do, she said, cutting him off gently. Because I've been there. He blinked. What? Sandra smiled faintly, a shadow flickering behind her eyes. I didn't finish college. Dropped out after a year. Everyone told me I was throwing my life away. But music was the only thing that made sense. David stared at her, the weight in his chest shifting, loosening. You? She nodded. So trust me when I say this, you're enough. Just as you are. For a moment, David couldn't speak. He just sat there, the words sinking into places he'd kept locked for years. And when he finally found his voice, it was barely a whisper. Thank you. Sandra smiled. A slow, warm smile that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. Now, she said, tapping the piano keys lightly. Play me something that sounds like hope. David laughed softly, the sound shaky but real. And then he played not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Because for the first time in years, the fog was lifting. Chapter 10. The turning point. The email hit David's inbox like a punch to the gut. Mandatory HR review, Thursday, 10 a.m. He stared at the screen, pulse thudding in his ears. It was happening. The thing he'd dreaded for 16 years. The leadership changes, the whispers about restructuring, it all led here. And when they asked for his credentials, the truth would come out. No diploma, no degree, just a man who'd been hiding behind hard work and silence. He spent the rest of the day moving like a ghost through the halls, scrubbing floors that didn't need scrubbing, avoiding Fred's booming voice and the curious glances from coworkers. Every sound felt too loud, every light too bright. His mind was a carousel of worst-case scenarios. They'll fire you. You'll lose everything. You should have stayed invisible. Thursday morning arrived like a storm. David sat in the HR office, hands clenched in his lap, staring at the polished table that reflected his own anxious face. Across from him sat two people in suits. One he recognized from corporate, the other a stranger with a clipboard and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Benson," the woman began, her tone smooth and professional. "Thank you for coming in." David nodded, throat dry. "Sure. We're conducting standard reviews as part of the leadership transition," she continued, verifying employment history, credentials, and performance records. There it was, the word that made his stomach twist. Credentials. She flipped through a file. "You've been with us 16 years. Excellent attendance. Strong performance reviews. No disciplinary actions." Her brows lifted slightly. "Impressive." David swallowed hard. "Thank you." "Now," she said, pen poised. "We just need to confirm your educational background." David's pulse spiked. His mouth opened, but no words came. He could feel the walls closing in, the years of silence collapsing like a house of cards. He was about to confess, about to watch everything he'd built crumble, when the door burst open. "Fred." "Sorry to interrupt," Fred boomed, striding in like he owned the place. "But if you're talking about Benson, you need to hear this." The woman blinked. "Excuse me." Fred planted his hands on the table, eyes blazing with the kind of loyalty that made David's throat tighten. "This guy is the backbone of this building. 16 years, never late, never a problem. You need something done, he's there. You need extra coverage, he's first in line. Hell, half the supervisors call him before they call me." David stared, stunned. Fred wasn't just defending him, he was fighting for him. "And another thing," Fred continued, voice rising. "You want leadership? You're looking at it. He trains new hires without being asked. He fixes problems before they start. He's the reason this place runs smooth." The woman cleared her throat. "Mr. Benson's credentials?" "Credentials don't mop floors," Fred snapped. "They don't keep the boilers running or the lights on. You want a piece of paper? Fine. But don't pretend it matters more than 16 years of showing up and doing the damn job." Silence fell like a curtain. The woman glanced at her colleague, then back at Fred, then at David, who sat frozen, heart pounding, eyes burning with something he hadn't felt in years. Gratitude, and maybe hope. When the meeting ended, David walked out in a daze. Fred clapped him on the back, grinning. "Told you, Benny. You're solid. Don't let anyone tell you different." David managed a shaky laugh. "Thanks, Fred." "Don't thank me," Fred said, eyes twinkling. "Just promise me one thing." "What's that?" "Keep playing that damn piano." David laughed again, real this time, and nodded. "Promise." That night, David sat at his keyboard, fingers hovering over the keys. His phone buzzed. "Sandra Marlow. How'd today go?" David stared at the screen, then typed, "Better than I expected. I want to see you." Her reply came fast, warm, and bright. "Then come find me." And for the first time in his life, David felt like the fog was clearing for good. Chapter 11. The leap. The restaurant wasn't fancy. Sandra had insisted on that. "No white tablecloths," she'd said with a laugh. "I want to talk to you, not whisper over crystal glasses." So they ended up at a little bistro tucked on a quiet street, all warm lights and soft jazz humming in the background. David liked it immediately, felt human, real. Sandra was already there when he arrived, sitting at a corner table with a glass of red wine catching the glow of the candles. She looked up as he approached, and her smile, slow, warm, unguarded, hit him like a chord that resolved after years of tension. "You made it," she said, standing to greet him. David smiled, nerves buzzing under his skin. "Wouldn't miss it." She tilted her head, eyes glinting. "You look good." David chuckled, tugging at his jacket. "I look like a guy who owns two jackets and picked the less wrinkled one." Sandra laughed, a rich, melodic sound that made something in his chest loosen. "Honesty looks good on you." They ordered simple food, pasta for her, steak for him, and when the plates arrived, conversation flowed like music. They talked about everything and nothing. Favorite songs, childhood memories, the weird quirks of jazz timing. Sandra teased him about his mysterious vibe, and David teased her about her habit of humming between sentences. "You do that," he said, grinning. "Little hums, like you're scoring your own life." Sandra laughed, eyes sparkling. "Maybe I am." David smiled, softer now. "If you are, it's a hell of a soundtrack." Her gaze held his for a beat too long, and the air shifted warmer, heavier, charged with something neither of them named. Halfway through dessert, Sandra leaned back, studying him like she was trying to memorize every line of his face. "You know," she said softly, "I've been wondering something." David raised a brow. "What's that? Why you keep pulling back?" The question landed like a note that didn't belong. A sharp, unexpected sound that made his pulse stumble. "I don't know what you mean." Sandra's smile was gentle, but her eyes were steady. "You do." You light up when you play. You laugh like you've been holding your breath for years. But then you go quiet, like you're afraid to take up space. David stared at his glass, the words tangled in his throat. I've spent most of my life trying not to. Sandra reached across the table, her fingers brushing his light, warm, grounding. You don't have to with me. David looked up, and the world narrowed to her eyes, dark, bright, infinite. Something inside him cracked open, and before he could think, before the old fears could claw him back, he spoke. I like you, he said, voice low, raw. More than I should. Sandra's smile was slow, tender, and a little dangerous. Then stop thinking about should. They walked out into the night, the city humming softly around them. The air was cool, carrying the scent of rain and possibility. Sandra stopped under a street lamp, turning to face him. Her curls glowed like ink in the light, and her eyes, God, her eyes, held him like gravity. David, she said, voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer. He couldn't. He just stepped closer, heart pounding, and when her breath brushed his cheek, he closed the distance. The kiss was soft at first, hesitant like a question. Then it deepened, slow and sure, like a melody finding its rhythm. David felt the world fall away, the noise, the fear, the years of hiding, until there was nothing but her lips, her warmth, her hand curling against his jaw like she'd been waiting to touch him forever. When they finally broke apart, Sandra smiled, a smile that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. Promise me something, she whispered. David's voice was rough. Anything. Don't disappear. He laughed softly, forehead resting against hers. Not a chance. That night, lying in bed, David replayed the kiss until sleep claimed him. For the first time in years, the fog was gone. And in its place was music, bright, wild, unstoppable. Chapter 12, Harmony. The studio was quiet except for the soft hum of the piano. David sat at the bench, fingers idly tracing the keys, while Sandra perched on a stool beside him, a notebook balanced on her knee. Her curls framed her face like ink strokes, and her eyes, bright, focused, were locked on the page as she scribbled something down. Okay, she said, tapping the pencil against the paper. We've got the chorus. Now we need a bridge that feels like falling. David raised a brow. Falling. Sandra grinned. Not literally, emotionally, like the moment you realize you're in too deep. David chuckled softly. You're asking a guy who's spent his life avoiding deep. Sandra's smile softened. And yet here you are. The words landed like a note that didn't belong. Unexpected, sharp, but somehow perfect. David looked away, pretending to study the keys, but his chest felt tight, his pulse quickening. Play something, Sandra said, her voice gentle now. Something that sounds like falling. David hesitated, then let his fingers move. A progression spilled out, soft, tentative, like a question whispered in the dark. Sandra closed her eyes, swaying slightly, and when she began to hum, the melody wrapped around his like silk threads. That, she murmured. That's it. They worked for hours, weaving notes and words into something that felt alive. Sandra's voice slid through the air like smoke, warm and rich, while David's hands danced across the keys, chasing the sound of her laughter between chords. Every time their eyes met, the room seemed to shrink, the world narrowing to just the two of them and the music pulsing between them like a heartbeat. By midnight, the song was finished. A slow, aching ballad that felt like confession. Sandra read the lyrics aloud, her voice low and steady. I was quiet, you were fire. Now I'm burning in the light. David swallowed hard. That's beautiful. Sandra smiled, her gaze locking on his. So are you. The words hit him like a chord resolving after years of tension. He wanted to speak, wanted to tell her everything. How she made the fog lift, how her voice felt like home. But before he could, she stood and held out her hand. Come on, she said. Let's play it. The stage was smaller than the club. A dimly lit lounge with a handful of tables and a crowd that leaned in close, hungry for something real. David sat at the piano, Sandra beside him, and when the first notes spilled out, the room hushed like someone had drawn a curtain over the noise. Sandra sang like she was bleeding truth, every word raw, every note shimmering with something that made David's chest ache. He played like his soul was on fire, his fingers chasing her voice through the melody until they collided in a harmony, so perfect it felt inevitable. When the last chord faded, silence hung for a breath, then the applause crashed like a wave. David barely heard it. He was looking at Sandra, and she was looking at him, and in her eyes was something bright and wild and unstoppable. She leaned in, her lips brushing his ear. You're mine now, she whispered, and David laughed softly, breathless. Promise? He murmured. Sandra's smile was slow, dangerous, and tender all at once. Promise. That night, as they walked out into the cool dark, David felt the weight of years fall away. He wasn't invisible anymore. He wasn't broken. He was music, and she was the melody that made him whole. Chapter 13. Crescendo. The lights were softer tonight, casting a golden glow over the stage like sunlight caught in amber. David sat at the piano, fingers resting lightly on the keys, waiting for the signal. The crowd was hushed, expectant, their faces blurred into a sea of shadows beyond the spotlight. But David wasn't looking at them. He was looking at her. Sandra stood at the mic, curls tumbling like dark silk, eyes bright and steady. When she smiled, it was the same smile that had undone him weeks ago, the one that had cracked open the walls he'd spent a lifetime building. And now, here they were, together, in the light. The band kicked in, a slow, sultry rhythm that curled through the air like smoke. David's fingers moved, coaxing the melody from ivory and ebony, and Sandra's voice slid in warm, rich, alive. The song was theirs, born from late nights and laughter, and the quiet confessions that had stitched their hearts together. I was quiet, you were fire. Now I'm burning in the light. The words hung in the air, shimmering like truth. David played like he was breathing, like every note was a heartbeat. And when Sandra turned her head and met his gaze mid-verse, the world narrowed to that single point of gravity. He wasn't invisible anymore. He wasn't broken. He wasn't the man hiding in the corners of his own life, afraid to take up space. He was here, on a stage in a spotlight with a woman who saw him, really saw him and loved what she found. After the show, the crowd roared, applause crashing like waves against the shore. David stood, breathless, as Sandra slipped her hand into his. Her fingers curled around his like they'd always belonged there. You were brilliant, she whispered, her lips brushing his ear. David laughed softly, the sound warm and unguarded. So were you. Sandra smiled, a slow, tender smile that felt like home. Ready for the next one? David looked at her, at the glow in her eyes, at the life waiting just beyond the horizon. And for the first time in years, he didn't hesitate. Always, he said. Later, in the quiet of his apartment, David sat at his keyboard, the city lights spilling through the window like liquid gold. His phone buzzed, a message from Sandra, simple and bright. Promise me you'll never stop playing. David smiled, fingers drifting over the keys as a new melody bloomed beneath his touch. He typed back, promise. And as the music filled the room, David realized something he'd never dared believe before. He wasn't a step behind anymore. He was exactly where he was meant to be.